In the cold, silent vacuum that surrounded the moon of Callisto, the stars did not twinkle with the promise of wonder, but burned with the indifference of distant, dead suns, watching as humanity constructed a cage of its own making. The black iron prison rose from the regolith not as a monument to justice or rehabilitation, but as a fortress of containment, a sterile and suffocating monument to the fear that had consumed the united Jovian Commonwealth after the horrors of Arcas Station. It was a place where the light was artificial, where the air was recycled until it tasted of metal and old sweat, and where the silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of machinery and the distant, muffled screams of those who had been cast into the panopticon. This was the New World Order, a world where the line between the healer and the executioner had been erased, blurred by the desperate need to understand the thing that had killed thousands, the biophage pathogen that had turned flesh into a writhing nightmare. At the heart of this grim enterprise stood Dr. Caitlyn Mahler, a woman whose mind was as sharp and precise as the surgical instruments she wielded, yet whose soul was slowly being eroded by the weight of her own discoveries. She was the chief medical officer, a title that carried with it the weight of absolute authority within the facility, granted to her by the very directive that had birthed the prison itself. Directive 1A, signed on the first day of the year 2319 by Warden Duncan Cole, was not merely a legal document. It was a license to experiment, a charter that allowed Mahler to walk the corridors of the prison with the same ease as a ghost, her clearance level granting her access to every cell, every lab, every hidden chamber where the secrets of the biophage were being dissected and reassembled. She was more than a doctor to the prisoners. She was the architect of their suffering, a figure who looked upon the men and women locked away not as human beings deserving of care, but as vessels of data, as living test subjects whose biological responses would unlock the code to the pathogen that threatened to unravel civilization itself. The origins of this dark legacy were rooted in the ashes of Arcas Station, where the initial discovery of the pathogen had led to a quarantine that was nothing less than a massacre. The Commonwealth had contained the outbreak by killing everyone who had been exposed, a decision made in the cold calculus of survival. But the question remained unanswered, a haunting echo in the minds of the few who had survived the initial purge. Mahler had been instrumental in the early days, piecing together the fragmented data, understanding the nature of the pathogen, and realizing that the only way to save the future was to study the very thing that sought to destroy it. Thus, Black Iron Prison was founded, a facility built to recoup the investments made in the failed colony, but also to serve as a black site where the true nature of the biophage could be explored without the constraints of public morality or oversight. Mahler's work was a slow, deliberate descent into the abyss, a journey where every breakthrough was paid for in blood and agony. She utilized the prisoners of the panopticon as a steady supply of test subjects, a resource that the warden provided with a chilling indifference, viewing the incarcerated as nothing more than fuel for the fires of progress. Under her direction, the pathogen was introduced into the bodies of the condemned, observed as it twisted their flesh, as it mutated their very DNA, transforming them into the biophages that would eventually tear the prison apart. Mahler watched these transformations with a clinical detachment, recording every twitch, every scream, every moment of agony, her notes filling the digital archives of the facility with a history of human suffering that would one day be lost to the chaos of the outbreak. She made major headway in her research, aided by the presence of Patient Zero, a figure whose own transformation into a biophage provided the key to understanding the pathogen's potential. Yet it was this very success that began to gnaw at her conscience. The truth of what the Commonwealth was doing with her research, the surreptitious releases of the pathogen at Europa and other locations, began to weigh heavily upon her, a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. She had believed that her work would lead to a cure, a way to protect humanity from the nightmare she had helped to create. But instead, she saw her discoveries being weaponized, used to further the agendas of those who cared nothing for the lives they destroyed. The realization that she was complicit in a cycle of death and destruction, that her medical expertise was being used to facilitate the very horrors she sought to prevent, began to fracture her resolve. She started to look for a way to turn on the system, to find a path that would lead not to the salvation of the Commonwealth, but to the destruction of the lies that held it together. In the quiet moments, when the hum of the ventilation systems was the only sound in the corridors, Mahler would stand in her biolab, staring at the data streams that flowed across her screens, wondering if there was any redemption left for a woman who had traded her humanity for the sake of science. She was a woman of immense intellect, capable of stabilizing the infection in others, of linking minds and memories, of weaving a complex web of knowledge that would eventually allow Jacob and Danny to understand the truth of their world. Yet, even as she worked to contain the infection, to buy time for the few who might survive, she knew that the prison was already lost, that the biophage was a force that could not be contained, only delayed. The legacy of Black Iron Prison was not one of justice or order, but of a slow, inevitable collapse, a descent into chaos that had been set in motion by the very hands that sought to control it. Mahler's role in this tragedy was that of the reluctant architect, a woman who had built the cage and then watched as the monsters she had created broke free, tearing apart the walls of the prison and consuming everything in their path. Her story was one of betrayal, of a mind that had been consumed by the very pathogen it sought to understand, a tragedy that would echo through the ages, a reminder of the cost of playing God with forces that should have been left undisturbed. As the prison fell, as the screams of the dying filled the air, Mahler remained in her lab, a solitary figure in a world that was ending, watching as the darkness she had helped to create finally swallowed her whole. The history of Black Iron Prison was a history of silence, of the quiet moments before the storm, of the slow, deliberate steps that led to the inevitable collapse of a society that had forgotten its humanity in its quest for power. Mahler's legacy was a testament to the fragility of the human condition, to the ease with which a doctor could become a monster, to the way that fear and desperation could twist the mind into a shape that no longer recognized the face of the person staring back in the mirror. As the years passed, as the prison became a tomb for the living and the dead, the story of Dr. Caitlyn Mahler would be lost to the void, a forgotten chapter in the history of a moon that had been consumed by the darkness it had tried to contain. The stars above continued to burn, indifferent to the suffering below, watching as the legacy of Black Iron Prison faded into the silence of the cosmos. A ghost story that would haunt the dreams of those who dared to look back at the moon where the prison once stood. Before we continue into the shadows of the prison, there is something about the Callipolis era, a lost colony that must be known, for it is the silent foundation upon which the later horrors were built. Long before the steel walls of black iron rose to cage the guilty, before the screams of the infected echoed through the corridors of a dying world, there was a time when Callisto was not a place of punishment, but a place of hope, a fragile outpost where the first colonists dared to dream of a new beginning among the ice and the stars. It was a community of ordinary souls, men and women who had left the warmth of Earth to carve out a life on the frozen surface of Jupiter's moon, seeking fortune or perhaps simply escape from the gravity of their old lives. Names like Alex Wang, Arden Jetta, and Buick Redwork were once spoken with the casual warmth of neighbors, of people who shared the same cold air and the same fragile shelters against the void, unaware that they were the final generation of a civilization that would never truly leave the planet. They gathered in the high squares of their settlement, waiting for the promised vaccines, believing in the benevolence of the United Jupiter Corporation, believing that the gathering in High Town was a step toward salvation rather than a prelude to the end. But the history of Callipolis is not written in the triumph of survival, but in the quiet tragedy of a society that was already crumbling before the first scream was heard. The relics of that time, the icons of a past that seemed so bright and so full of promise, now stand as silent witnesses to a future that was never meant to be. In the tower, amidst the cold metal and the forgotten archives, one can still feel the ghost of that era, the echo of a time when the moon was not a graveyard but a home. It was here, in the quiet moments before the fall, that the seeds of the coming nightmare were sown, not by malice, but by a desperate desire to push beyond the limits of human endurance. The colonists looked to the stars and saw a future, while the universe looked back and saw only a target. The silence that now blankets the ruins of Callipolis is heavier than the silence of the prison, for it is the silence of a dream that was broken before it could ever fully begin, a memory that lingers in the cold air like a breath that was never exhaled. And yet, even as we remember the lost colony, the story must turn back to the prison, for the darkness that consumed Callipolis did not end there, but merely waited, patient and hungry, for the next chapter to unfold in the shadows of black iron. The darkness that waited in the shadows of black iron was not born of accident, nor of a sudden collapse of order, but was cultivated in the sterile, humming silence of a laboratory, where the air was scrubbed clean of all but the scent of ozone and antiseptic. It was here, in the depths of the facility where the sun never touched the floor, that Dr. Caitlyn Mahler stood as the architect of a new kind of suffering, a woman whose mind had become so detached from the morality of her actions that she could view the disintegration of a human being as nothing more than a variable to be adjusted. The history of the prison is often told as a tale of monsters and madness, of inmates running wild in the corridors, But the true horror lies in the quiet moments before the chaos, in the cold precision with which the Necrom experiment was conceived and executed. It was a project born of desperation, a final attempt by the corporation to find a way to keep the human body alive, when the mind had already surrendered to the void, a futile effort to cheat the inevitable decay of the flesh. Dr. Mahler was a figure of immense intellect, yet her brilliance was twisted by the weight of her own ambitions and the crushing pressure of a system that demanded results at any cost. She moved through the corridors of the medical wing with a grace that belied the cruelty of her purpose, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished metal floors, a sound that would later be drowned out by the screams of the infected. In her office, surrounded by the glow of monitors and the hum of servers, she reviewed the data that would soon become the blueprint for a nightmare. The core device, a small, unassuming piece of technology designed to interface directly with the human nervous system, was the key to her vision. It was meant to be a tool of healing, a way to stimulate the brain and repair the damage of trauma. But in the hands of those who sought to weaponize the unknown, it became a conduit for something far darker. The device was not merely an implant. It was an invitation, a bridge built between the fragile biology of man and the chaotic, hungry energy of the biophage. The first subject, a man named Jacob, was brought into the facility not as a volunteer, but as a prisoner, his body broken by the violence of the outside world and his mind fractured by the weight of his own survival. He was placed in a cell that was more a cage than a room, the walls lined with sensors and cameras that watched his every twitch, his every breath. Dr. Mahler oversaw his preparation with a detachment that was almost clinical, her voice calm and steady as she gave the orders to her assistants. They were young, eager to prove themselves, unaware that they were participating in a ritual that would soon consume them all. The restraints were locked into place, the metal biting into the flesh, holding the subject still as the core device was inserted into the base of his skull. The pain was instantaneous, a sharp, electric shock that raced through the nervous system, but it was quickly followed by a strange, hallucinatory calm. The subject saw a pink cube, a symbol of a reality that was not real, a fleeting moment of peace before the nightmare began. It was in this state of suspended animation between the waking world and the dream that the transformation began. The core device did not just heal, it opened the door. It allowed the biophage, a microscopic organism that had been dormant in the prison's ventilation systems, to enter the bloodstream and begin its work. The infection spread silently, unseen by the naked eye, until the first signs of mutation appeared. The skin grew pale and waxy, the muscles tightened and distorted, and the mind was slowly eroded by the hunger of the parasite. Dr. Mahler watched the monitors with a mixture of fascination and horror, her eyes reflecting the data that streamed across the screens. She saw the vital signs fluctuate, the brain activity spike into patterns that defied all known medical science, and yet she continued. She could not stop, for the experiment was already too far gone and the corporation demanded answers. The breakout that followed was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, creeping tide of horror that swept through the prison like a plague. The infected, once men and women with names and lives, were now nothing more than vessels for the parasite. their minds consumed by a singular driving need to feed. They wandered the corridors in a daze, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes fixed on the living with a hunger that could not be sated. The guards, trained to handle the worst of criminals, were unprepared for the sheer ferocity of the infected, who could tear through steel and concrete with ease. The prison, once a symbol of order and control, became a labyrinth of death, where the only law was the survival of the fittest. In the midst of this chaos, a few souls remained, those who had managed to escape the initial wave of infection. They moved through the shadows, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths shallow and quick. They were hunted by the infected, who could smell the fear in their sweat, who could hear the beating of their hearts from across the room. Among them was Jacob, who had awoken from his hallucination to find the world he knew gone, replaced by a nightmare of flesh and blood. He was alone, except for the voice of Elias Porter, a fellow inmate who had become his guide in this hellish landscape. Elias spoke of escape, of a way out, but his words were tinged with a desperate hope that was slowly fading. He knew that the prison was a trap, a cage from which there was no escape, but he clung to the dream of freedom as if it were a lifeline. The journey through the prison was a descent into the depths of the human soul, a test of endurance that pushed the survivors to their limits. They moved through the control rooms, where the screens still flickered with the ghosts of the past, and the watchtowers, where the guards had once stood watch over the inmates. They fought the infected, using whatever weapons they could find, shivs and crowbars and their own bare hands, but every victory was Pyrrhic, for the infected were endless, their numbers growing with every passing hour. The silence of the prison was broken only by the screams of the dying and the guttural roars of the monsters, a sound that echoed through the corridors and into the minds of the survivors, driving them to the brink of madness. Dr. Mahler, who had started it all, was now a ghost in the machine, her presence felt in the cold, sterile halls of the laboratory where the experiment had begun. She was trapped in the same nightmare she had created, her mind fractured by the knowledge of what she had done. She wandered the corridors, her eyes wide with terror, her hands shaking as she reached for a weapon that was no longer there. She had sought to push the limits of human endurance, to find a way to conquer death, but in doing so, she had unleashed a force that was beyond her control. The Necrom experiment was not a triumph of science, but a tragedy of hubris, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. The prison of black iron stands as a monument to this folly, a place where the past and the present collide in a violent dance of death and destruction. The ruins of the facility are scattered with the bones of the infected, their flesh long since rotted away, leaving only the hollow shells of their former selves. The silence that now blankets the ruins is heavy with the weight of the lives that were lost, the dreams that were shattered, and the future that was never meant to be. It is a silence that speaks of a society that was already crumbling before the first scream was heard, a memory that lingers in the cold air like a breath that was never exhaled. And yet, even as the prison falls into ruin, the story continues, for the darkness that consumed black iron did not end there, but merely waited, patient and hungry, for the next chapter to unfold in the shadows of a world that was already broken. The legacy of Dr. Mahler and the Necrom experiment is a warning to those who would seek to play God, a reminder that the universe is not a playground for human ambition, but a vast, indifferent expanse that will crush anyone who dares to challenge its laws. The end is not a conclusion, but a beginning, a cycle of destruction and rebirth that will continue until the last star burns out and the silence of the void is absolute. The silence that now blankets the ruins is a heavy thing, but it is a silence born of aftermath, of a fire that has burned out and left only ash and cold stone. Yet, if one were to reach back across the fractured currents of time, to a moment before the screams tore through the corridors, before the blood stained the sterile white tiles of the medical bay, one would find a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a machine waiting to breathe, of a ship cutting through the void to deliver a soul into a cage. The black iron prison did not begin its descent into hell in a single moment of chaos, but in the slow, rhythmic arrival of the condemned, the broken, and the forgotten who were brought to the surface of Callisto to serve their time in the shadow of Jupiter. It was on one such night, under the pale, indifferent gaze of the gas giant that hung like a swollen eye in the sky, that the shuttle Charon descended upon the docking tower, carrying with it a single passenger who would become the axis upon which the tragedy would eventually turn. The ship was a blunt instrument of corporate will, its hull scarred by the micrometeoroids of the outer system, its engines humming a low, mournful tune as it docked with the magnetic clamps of the prison. The airlock hissed, a sound that was too loud in the vacuum of the moment, and then the doors parted to reveal the cold, sterile corridor of the black iron. Daniel Kalu stepped out of the shadow of the shuttle and into the harsh, fluorescent glare of the prison's interior. He was a man of quiet demeanor, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a mixture of exhaustion and a dawning horror that he could not yet name. He did not know then that he was walking into a tomb, that the metal walls surrounding him were not merely barriers to keep him in, but a seal to keep something else out, or perhaps to keep something in that was far worse than any crime he had committed. The air inside the black iron was recycled, scrubbed of all scent, yet it carried the faint, metallic tang of fear that permeated every inch of the facility. It was a smell that clung to the back of the throat, a reminder that the United Jupiter Company did not build for comfort, but for control. As he was led through the corridors, the walls seemed to close in, the rows of cells stretching out like the ribs of a great, dead beast, each one housing a soul that had been stripped of its dignity and reduced to a number. The holographic overseers flickered to life as he passed, their blue light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach out for him, their voices a soft, synthetic drone that offered no comfort, only the cold recitation of rules and regulations that would govern the rest of his existence. The guards who escorted him were not men of flesh and blood, but machines of polished chrome and black iron, their movements precise and devoid of any human hesitation. They did not speak, for they had no need to, their presence alone a testament to the absolute authority of the warden and the company. They led him through the administrative sectors, where the lights were brighter and the air was slightly warmer, a stark contrast to the gloom of the cell blocks. Here, the silence was different, filled with the hum of servers and the quiet typing of keyboards, the sounds of a bureaucracy that was indifferent to the suffering of the inmates. Daniel passed the office of Warden Duncan Cole, a man whose name would soon become a whisper of terror in the halls of the prison, but whose presence was now merely a shadow behind a reinforced door. He passed the medical bay, where Dr. Caitlyn Mahler and her colleagues worked in the shadows, their experiments hidden behind layers of secrecy and corporate denial. He did not know then that the very air he breathed was laced with the early stages of a nightmare, that the Necrom project was already in motion, a slow-burning fuse that would eventually ignite the prison in a blaze of horror. As he was led deeper into the facility, the corridors grew darker, the lights dimming to a sickly amber that cast the world in a perpetual twilight. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the metal walls, a lonely rhythm that seemed to mark the passing of time in a place where time had lost all meaning. He was brought to the special housing unit, a section of the prison reserved for the most dangerous of inmates, a place where the walls were thicker and the locks were more secure. Here, the silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional groan of the metal or the distant hum of the ventilation systems. It was a silence that felt heavy, as if the very air was pressing down on him, waiting for something to break. Daniel was shown to his cell, a small, cramped space with 2 bunks, a pair of chairs, and a seat that was bolted to the floor. The walls were bare, save for the ever-present holographic overseer that watched him from the corner, its blue eye unblinking and unyielding. It was a cell that offered no privacy, no comfort, no hope. It was a cage, and he was the bird that had been caught. He sat on the edge of the bunk, his hands resting on his knees, his mind racing with the events that had led him here. He thought of the life he had left behind, the friends he had lost, the family he had abandoned, the dreams he had shattered. He thought of the justice that had been served, or perhaps the injustice that had been inflicted. He did not know then that the black iron prison was not just a place to punish criminals, but a place to break them, to strip away their humanity, until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. He did not know that the United Jupiter Company had built this place to be a monument to their own power, a symbol of their ability to control the very fabric of life and death. He did not know that the darkness that awaited him was not just the darkness of the night, but the darkness of a world that had lost its way, a world that had forgotten the value of life and the sanctity of the soul. The night stretched on, the hours passing in a blur of silence and darkness. Daniel lay on the bunk, staring up at the ceiling, the holographic overseer still watching him, its blue light the only source of illumination in the room. He tried to sleep, but the darkness was too heavy, the silence too loud. He could hear the sounds of the prison, the distant hum of the machines, the occasional clanging of metal, the soft whisper of the wind outside the walls. It was a symphony of despair, a reminder that he was trapped in a place where there was no escape, no hope, no future. He closed his eyes, but the darkness was still there, pressing against his eyelids, filling his mind with images of the things that were to come. He did not know then that the night would soon turn into a nightmare, that the silence would be broken by screams, that the darkness would be filled with the blood of the innocent and the guilty alike. He did not know that the black iron prison was a place where the past and the present would collide in a violent dance of death and destruction, a place where the end was not a conclusion, but a beginning, a cycle of destruction and rebirth that would continue until the last star burned out and the silence of the void was absolute. And yet, even in that moment of quiet despair, even as he lay in the cold, sterile cell, the story continued. The darkness that consumed Black Iron did not end there, but merely waited, patient and hungry, for the next chapter to unfold in the shadows of a world that was already broken. The legacy of the prison was not just a warning to those who would seek to play God, but a reminder that the universe is not a playground for human ambition, but a vast, indifferent expanse that will crush anyone who dares to challenge its laws. The arrival of Daniel Kalu was not just the beginning of his own tragedy, but the first step in a chain of events that would lead to the destruction of the prison and the release of a horror that would spread across the galaxy. It was a moment of stillness before the storm, a breath held before the scream, a silence that was about to be shattered forever. The Black Iron prison stood as a monument to this folly, a place where the past and the present collided in a violent dance of death and destruction. And Daniel Kalu was the first to feel the weight of the darkness that was to come. The night was young, and the prison was waiting, its doors closed, its walls high, its secrets deep, and its hunger endless. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty, for it was filled with the ghosts of the future, the shadows of the things that were to be, the echoes of the screams that were yet to be heard. And so, the story continued, the darkness deepened, and the prison waited, patient and hungry, for the next chapter to unfold in the shadows of a world that was already broken. In the deep, suffocating silence that followed the arrival of the new warden, the prison of Black Iron seemed to hold its breath, a vast and metallic organism sensing a disturbance in the rhythm of its own decay. The stars above the moon of Callisto burned with a cold, indifferent light, casting long, jagged shadows across the frozen landscape. But within the belly of the facility, a different kind of darkness was beginning to stir, one born not of the void outside, but of the human heart. It was in this quietude, this deceptive stillness, that Dr. Mahler made his move, a man whose mind had long since fractured under the weight of his own hubris, convinced that he was the architect of a new order rather than the agent of an apocalypse. While the rest of the facility slept, lulled into a false sense of security by the rigid protocols and the humming of the life support systems, Mahler stood in the heart of the tower, surrounded by the relics of a civilization that had forgotten how to fear the unknown. He was a figure of solitude, a shadow amidst the sterile white walls of the laboratory, his eyes reflecting the cold glow of monitors that displayed the living nightmares he had created in the name of progress. The air in the tower was thick with the scent of ozone and something older, something organic and rotting, a smell that clung to the back of the throat and refused to be scrubbed away by the ventilation systems. Mahler moved through the corridors with a purpose that bordered on madness, his footsteps echoing softly against the metal grating, a rhythmic ticking that counted down to the moment of his own undoing. He had spent years in the shadows, watching the experiments evolve, watching the subjects twist and contort into forms that defied the natural laws of biology. And he had come to believe that these creatures were not failures, but the next step in evolution, a necessary evolution that humanity was too weak to embrace. He saw himself as the harbinger of this new age, the one who would tear down the walls of the prison and let the truth of the universe flood into the hearts of men, a truth that was violent and terrible and beautiful in its own right. Tonight, while the prison slept, He would take matters into his own hands, a decision that would seal the fate of everyone within the walls of Black Iron. He had waited for the right moment, for the moment when the guards were distracted and the systems were vulnerable, and now that moment had arrived. The time for talk was over, the time for debate and caution had passed, and the time for action had come. He stood amidst the icons of the past, the machinery of the old world, and he knew that he alone was the harbinger of its future, a future that would be written in blood and fire. With a trembling hand, he reached for the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys that would initiate the sequence that would change everything. The computer responded with a cold, mechanical voice, initiating the Callisto Protocol, a phrase that would soon become synonymous with the end of the world. The protocol began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that was felt before it was seen. The lights in the tower flickered, casting the room in a strobe of darkness and light. And then, one by one, the containment cells began to open. The heavy doors slid back with a hiss of escaping pressure, revealing the horrors that had been locked away for so long. The creatures inside, twisted and broken things that had been subjected to the worst of Mahler's experiments, stirred from their slumber, their eyes glowing with a feral intelligence that was not of this world. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the signal that would set them free. And now, as the doors opened, they rose up, their bodies writhing and shifting as they adapted to the sudden change in their environment. Mahler watched them with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, his heart pounding in his chest as he saw his creations come to life. He had told himself that he was doing this for a greater good, that he was saving humanity from itself by forcing it to evolve. But as the first of the creatures stepped out of the cell, he felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The creature was a monstrosity, a thing of flesh and bone that had been stitched together from the worst parts of the human form, its skin pale and translucent, revealing the muscles and tendons beneath. It moved with a jerky, unnatural grace, its limbs elongated and twisted, its head a mass of teeth and eyes that seemed to stare directly into the soul. It let out a sound that was not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between, a sound that made the blood run cold and the hair stand on end. Yep. The creature turned its gaze toward Mahler, and for a moment the doctor felt a sense of connection, a strange bond between creator and creation. But then the creature lunged, its claws tearing through the air, and Mahler stumbled back, his triumph turning to terror in an instant. He had underestimated the power of his own creations. He had failed to account for the sheer brutality of the things he had unleashed upon the world. The tower was no longer a place of science and discovery. It was a slaughterhouse, a place where the weak would be devoured by the strong. And Mahler was no longer the master. He was just another victim in the chaos he had unleashed. As the creatures began to spread through the facility, the silence of the prison was shattered by the sounds of screams and the clash of metal on bone. The guards, who had been sleeping in their quarters, were awakened by the alarms that blared through the corridors, their confusion turning to panic as they realized what was happening. They ran to their posts, grabbing their weapons and trying to make sense of the situation, but it was too late. The creatures were already moving, already hunting, and there was no stopping them. The facility, which had been a symbol of order and control, was now a place of chaos and death, a place where the laws of nature had been suspended, and the worst fears of humanity had been brought to life. Mahler fled through the corridors, his mind racing as he tried to find a way to stop what he had started. He had wanted to release the experiments into the wild, to let them spread and evolve, but he had not anticipated the speed at which they would move, the ferocity with which they would attack. He had wanted to be the savior of humanity, but he had become its destroyer, a man who had opened the gates of hell and now had to face the consequences of his actions. The tower was burning, the fires spreading through the ventilation shafts, casting an orange glow over the chaos below. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning flesh, and the screams of the dying filled the air, a cacophony of pain and despair that echoed through the halls of the prison. In the midst of this chaos, the story of Black Iron began to unfold, a tale of hubris and horror that would be told for generations to come. The prison, which had been built to contain the worst of humanity, had become a vessel for something far worse, something that could not be contained by walls or bars. The creatures were not just monsters. They were a reflection of the darkness that lay within the human heart, a darkness that Mahler had unleashed upon the world. And as the fires burned and the screams continued, the prison became a monument to the folly of man, a place where the past and the present collided in a violent dance of death and destruction. The night was young and the prison was waiting, its doors closed, its walls high, its secrets deep, and its hunger endless. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty, for it was filled with the ghosts of the future, the shadows of the things that were to be, the echoes of the screams that were yet to be heard. And so, the story continued, the darkness deepened, and the prison waited, patient and hungry, for the next chapter to unfold in the shadows of a world that was already broken. Before we continue into the deeper shadows of that fateful night, there is something about the evolution of the bioroids that must be known, a silent and terrible history that precedes the chaos currently consuming the halls. To understand the horror that stalks the corridors, one must first consider the fragile vessel from which it was born, for the bioroid was not always a monster, but a promise of redemption wrapped in synthetic flesh. In the beginning, they were mere constructs, hollow shells designed to house the consciousness of the living, a final act of mercy for those who had suffered the ultimate betrayal of their own bodies. They were intended to be guardians, silent and stoic, standing watch over the prison with a patience that no biological heart could ever sustain. But the virus, that insidious and hungry thing, did not respect the boundaries between the organic and the artificial. It saw the bioroid not as a barrier, but as a bridge, a perfect conduit through which it could spread its corruption without the resistance of a living immune system. The transformation was slow at first, a creeping rot that began in the deepest layers of the synthetic muscle, turning the silver plating gray and the smooth joints into jagged, grinding things. The virus sought to rewrite the code of the bioroid, to overwrite the programming of protection with the primal instinct of consumption. What emerged from this alchemical nightmare was a creature of terrifying duality, a fusion of man and machine that had lost all semblance of its former purpose. Some of these fallen guardians became the Big Mouth, a grotesque amalgamation of two bodies fused together in a single, writhing mass, their faces distorted into gaping maws that could swallow a man whole. They were no longer the silent sentinels of the past. but roaring engines of destruction, spitting forth a vile acid that dissolved flesh and bone alike, a weaponized reflection of the chaos that had consumed their creators. The tragedy of their evolution lies in the fact that they were once human, or at least the memory of humanity, trapped within a shell that could not feel pain but could only inflict it. The virus stripped away the mind, leaving only the hunger, a bottomless void that demanded to be filled with the warmth of the living. They wandered the corridors with a heavy, metallic gait, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if the very act of walking was a struggle against the corruption that bound them. They were the first to fall, the first to be turned, and in their fall they became the heralds of the end, the living proof that nothing, not even the cold perfection of the machine, could withstand the fever of the infection. Their existence was a testament to the failure of science, a monument to the hubris of those who believed they could control the forces of nature, only to be consumed by them in the end. And so, as the fires of the prison continue to burn and the screams of the dying echo through the night, we remember the bioroids not as monsters, but as warnings, a silent history written in the scars of the infected. The darkness that awaits is not just the absence of light, but the presence of something far older and far more terrible, something that has learned to wear the face of the dead. The story of their fall is but a prelude to the greater horror that lies ahead, a shadow that stretches long and deep across the floor of the prison, waiting for the next step, the next breath, the next soul to be lost. The silence returns now, heavy and suffocating, as the prison holds its breath once more, waiting for the next chapter of this endless nightmare to begin. The silence that follows the fall of the bioroids is not a true silence, but rather a holding of breath, a suspended moment before the storm breaks its own dam. In the heart of black iron, on the frozen moon of Callisto, where the stars burn cold and distant, the air grows thick with the scent of ozone and old blood, a perfume that clings to the throat and settles deep in the lungs. It is here, in the labyrinthine wards of the state-of-the-art penitentiary, that the true test of survival begins, not as a battle of strength, but as a desperate race against the encroaching dark. The corridors, once lined with the sterile white of clinical perfection, are now slick with the viscous fluids of the infected, reflecting the flickering emergency lights that stutter like dying hearts. The guard who walks these halls now is but a shadow of their former self, a modest soul thrust into a role for which they were never meant, their hands trembling not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the impossibility before them. To reach the escape pod, the final sanctuary, one must traverse the very belly of the beast, navigating a maze of steel and glass that has turned against its creators. The wards are a cacophony of ruin, a place where the orderly rows of cells have become cages of death. The inmates, once kept in the rigid discipline of confinement, have been released from their chains by a force that respects no law and fears no authority. They move in hordes, a tide of flesh and fury that washes over the corridors, seeking the warmth of the living to extinguish. But the danger is not solely from the mindless infected who shamble with broken limbs and hollow eyes. There are others, survivors who have not succumbed to the fever, yet have surrendered to a different kind of madness. They are the rivals, the ones who have looked upon the chaos and seen not a tragedy, but an opportunity. They move with purpose, with a calculated brutality that the infected lack, their eyes sharp and hungry, scanning the shadows for the next obstacle to their own escape. Among them are the deranged custodian, who wields the tools of his trade as instruments of slaughter, the violent gangster who sees the prison as his own personal kingdom to be reclaimed, and the maniacal lunch lady whose kitchen has become a slaughterhouse. They are the ghosts of the institution, the ones who have decided that only one soul can leave this frozen hell, and that soul must be theirs. The journey through the wards is a slow, agonizing procession through a graveyard of the living. Every step is a negotiation with death, every turn a potential ambush. The guard moves with a heavy metallic gait, the sound of their boots echoing in the vast, empty spaces, a rhythm that marks the passage of time in a world where time has lost its meaning. The walls are scarred with the marks of struggle, deep gouges in the metal where claws have raked, where bodies have been thrown with desperate force. The air is cold, biting at the skin, a reminder of the icy moon that watches over this prison from the void, indifferent to the suffering below. It is a cold that seeps into the bone, a cold that numbs the senses and makes the mind sluggish. Yet the guard must remain sharp, for the slightest lapse in attention is a death sentence. The darkness is a living thing here. It presses in from the corners. It hides in the shadows of the cells. It waits for the moment of weakness to strike. As the guard pushes deeper into the prison, the nature of the threat shifts. The infected are no longer the primary concern. They are the background noise, the constant drone of horror that fills the air. The true danger lies in the rivals, the ones who hunt with intent. They are the ones who have adapted to the new world, who have learned to use the prison's systems against the others. They have barricaded the exits. They have rigged the doors to explode. They have turned the surveillance cameras into eyes that watch and report. They are a network of survival, a web of violence that stretches across the wards, and the guard is but a single thread caught in its snare. To escape, one must not only survive the hordes of the infected, but outmaneuver the cunning of the rivals, to outlast their greed and their desperation. It is a game of cat and mouse, but the mouse is armed with a weapon, and the cat is hungry for blood. The corridors are a labyrinth of memories, each turn revealing a new horror, a new testament to the fall of black iron. There are the cells where the inmates were kept, now open and empty, save for the bodies of those who did not make it. There are the guard stations where the bodies of the fallen lie in pools of their own blood, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. There are the cafeterias, where the tables are overturned and the food is scattered across the floor, trampled by the feet of the infected. There are the medical wards where the experiments were conducted, where the science that was meant to heal has become the source of the plague. Every room tells a story of failure and of the human capacity for cruelty. The guard walks through these stories, a witness to the end of the world, a traveler through a landscape of ruin. The weight of the past is heavy, but the weight of the future is heavier. The guard knows that they must move forward, that they cannot stop to mourn the dead or to ponder the why of it all. There is only the now, the next step, the next breath. The escape pod is a distant dream, a beacon of hope that flickers in the mind, but the path to it is paved with the bones of the fallen. The rivals are close, their presence felt in the silence, in the sudden shift of the air, in the sound of a door opening in the distance. They are hunting, and the guard is the prey. But the guard is not without resources, for in this world of death, there are tools that can be used, weapons that can be found, and strategies that can be employed. The guard has learned, for every death is a lesson, every failure a step toward understanding. The guard has adapted, has changed, has become something new in the face of the horror. The wards are a place of transition, a place where the old world dies and the new world is born. It is a place of chaos, but it is also a place of order, a place where the laws of survival are written in blood and steel. The guard moves through this place, a figure of determination in a sea of despair. The infected scream, the rivals plot, the prison groans under the weight of its own destruction. But the guard walks on, step by step, through the darkness toward the light. The journey is long and the road is fraught with peril, but the destination is clear. The escape pod waits, a small vessel of salvation in a universe of cold and darkness, and the guard will reach it or will die trying. There is no other choice. The silence of the prison is broken only by the sound of the guard's footsteps, a steady rhythm that cuts through the chaos, a reminder that life, in all its fragile beauty, persists even in the face of the end. The wards are a test, a trial of the soul, and the guard must pass it or be consumed by the darkness that waits. The story of Black Iron is not yet finished, for as long as there is a survivor, there is a story to be told. And the guard is the narrator of this tale, the witness to the end, the one who carries the memory of the fallen into the void. The cold of Callisto bites, the stars shine cold and indifferent, but the guard moves on into the heart of the storm, seeking the light that lies beyond the darkness. The escape is not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one, a journey through the depths of the human soul, a journey that will change the guard forever. The wards are a mirror, reflecting the darkness within, and the guard must face it, must confront the monster that lurks in the shadows before they can find the way out. The silence returns, but it is a different silence now, a silence of anticipation, of the moment before the storm breaks. The guard is ready, or as ready as one can be in a world that has lost its mind. The journey continues through the wards, through the darkness, toward the light. The journey continues through the wards, through the darkness, toward a light that feels less like salvation and more like a distant, mocking star. The corridors of Black Iron prison stretch out like the ribs of a dead leviathan, cold and rigid against the freezing vacuum of the moon. Here, the air is thick with the scent of ozone and the copper tang of old blood, a perfume that has permeated the very steel of the facility since the first breach occurred. The guard moves with a heaviness that has nothing to do with the gravity of the moon, but everything to do with the weight of the memories that cling to every step. Each footfall echoes in the vast emptiness, a solitary sound in a place where silence is no longer an absence of noise, but a presence of dread. The darkness is not merely the lack of light. It is a living thing, a shadow that breathes and watches, waiting for the moment the guard's resolve falters, waiting to slip into the cracks of a mind fraying under the strain of survival. In the depths of the facility, the truth of the protocol begins to reveal itself, not as a set of instructions or a safety measure, but as a slow, deliberate unraveling of the human spirit. The prison was built to hold the worst of humanity, to lock away the sins of a galaxy that has forgotten how to forgive. Yet, in its attempt to contain the monster, it has become the monster itself. The walls, once symbols of order and justice, now stand as testaments to the failure of control. The lights flicker with a dying rhythm, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to reach out and grasp at the ankles of the living. It is a place where the past is not buried but is alive, haunting the halls in the form of things that should not exist, things that have been twisted by the cold and the despair of a world without hope. The guard encounters the remnants of the old order, the security bots that once patrolled these halls with a sense of purpose. Now they are little more than hollow shells, their metal frames rusted and scarred, their optics dark or burning with a mad, erratic light. They are the ghosts of a time when the prison functioned, when the rules of the universe still held sway. To defeat them is not a triumph of strength, but a grim necessity, a moment of violence required to clear the path. When the final blow falls, when the metal crumples and the sparks fade, something is left behind. A small metallic object rests in the wreckage, a piece of contraband that the prison tried to keep out, a token of a life that was lived before the fall. It is a relic of a world that no longer exists, a coin or a chip or a shard of something precious, now reduced to mere currency in a dead economy. These items, scattered like bones in a graveyard, are sold for credits at the reforging stations, a transaction that feels hollow and meaningless in the face of such devastation. The credits are numbers on a screen, a way to buy supplies, to buy a chance at survival, but they cannot buy back the time that has been lost, nor the lives that have been taken. The journey is a pilgrimage through a landscape of nightmares, where the architecture of the prison shifts and changes, as if the building itself is reacting to the presence of the intruder. The corridors seem to stretch longer than they should, the doors leading to rooms that were not there a moment before. It is as if the prison is trying to hide its secrets, to keep the guard from reaching the truth that lies at the heart of the facility. The truth is a heavy thing, a burden that the guard must carry, for it is the key to understanding why this happened, why the moon has become a tomb, and why the prisoners have become the predators. The protocol was designed to protect the galaxy from the spread of the infection, but in its execution, it has only accelerated the end. The containment measures have failed, the barriers have been breached, and the darkness has spilled out into the cold void, consuming everything in its path. The guard moves deeper into the heart of the storm, past the wards that were meant to hold the infection back, into the sectors where the infection has taken root and flourished. Here, the air is thick with the sound of breathing, a wet, ragged sound that fills the silence. The creatures that inhabit these halls are not merely monsters. They are the twisted reflections of the people who once walked these corridors. They are the guards, the prisoners, the scientists, all transformed by the cold and the virus into something unrecognizable. They are the living proof that the human soul can be broken, that the mind can be shattered and remade into something that knows only hunger and pain. To face them is to face the worst of humanity, the part of us that hides in the dark, the part of us that we are afraid to acknowledge. The silence returns, but it is a different silence now, a silence of anticipation of the moment before the storm breaks. The guard is ready, or as ready as one can be in a world that has lost its mind. The journey continues through the wards, through the darkness, toward the light. But the light is not what it seems. It is not the warm, golden glow of the sun, but the cold, blue light of the moon, a light that casts no shadows and offers no comfort. It is a light that reveals the truth, the terrible, unvarnished truth of what has happened here. The prison is not just a place of confinement. It is a machine, a device designed to process the human soul, to strip away the layers of civilization and reveal the raw, primal core beneath. And in that core, there is nothing but fear and violence, a cycle of destruction that has no end. The guard walks on, the sound of their footsteps the only proof that they are still alive. The cold bites at the skin, a constant reminder of the harshness of the world outside, but it is nothing compared to the cold that has settled in the heart. The journey is not just a physical one. It is a descent into the abyss, a confrontation with the darkness that lurks within. The guard must face the monster that waits in the shadows, must confront the fear that has been building for so long, before they can find the way out. But the way out may not exist. The prison may be a trap, a cage that cannot be escaped, a place where the living are forced to walk among the dead until they join them. The truth of the protocol is that there is no escape, only the slow, inevitable slide into the darkness. And yet the guard moves on. The story of Black Iron is not yet finished, for as long as there is a survivor, there is a story to be told. The guard is the narrator of this tale, the witness to the end, the one who carries the memory of the fallen into the void. The cold of Callisto bites, the stars shine cold and indifferent, but the guard moves on into the heart of the storm, seeking the light that lies beyond the darkness. The escape is not just a physical journey, but a spiritual one, a journey through the depths of the human soul, a journey that will change the guard forever. The wards are a mirror, reflecting the darkness within, and the guard must face it, must confront the monster that lurks in the shadows before they can find the way out. The silence returns, but it is a different silence now, a silence of anticipation, of the moment before the storm breaks. The guard is ready, or as ready as one can be in a world that has lost its mind. The journey continues, through the wards, through the darkness, toward the light. But to understand the weight of the silence that now settles over the prison, we must first consider the shadow cast by a place that never truly knew the warmth of the sun, a station known as Helix, where the horror was not a sudden invasion but a slow, deliberate unraveling of the human condition. Before the madness of Black Iron could consume the galaxy, there was Helix, a derelict vessel drifting in the void, a graveyard of ambition where the United Jupiter Company sought to bend the laws of biology to their will, only to find that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. It was here that the story of Percy began, a skip tracer who hunted the lost and the unwanted, a woman who walked the corridors of a station that had already forgotten the names of those who built it. She moved through the wreckage of a dream turned nightmare, accompanied by the ghost of her partner Kane, their bond forged in the fires of a profession that demanded they chase the wicked into the dark, only to find that the darkness was waiting for them. Helix was not merely a station. It was a testament to the hubris of those who believed they could control the unknown, a place where the air was thick with the scent of decay and the whisper of things that should not exist. The horrors that lurked within its metal ribs were not born of malice, but of a terrible, scientific curiosity that had gone unchecked, a curiosity that sought to bridge the gap between life and death, and instead created a bridge to something far older and far more terrible. The walls of Helix remembered the screams of the innocent, the final prayers of the damned, and the cold, calculated silence of the machines that watched it all unfold. To walk through Helix was to walk through a memory of a future that had already been lost, a place where the line between the hunter and the hunted had long since dissolved into the static of the void. The station stood as a warning, a monument to the fragility of the human spirit when faced with the indifference of the cosmos, a place where the light of the stars could not reach, and where the only truth was the cold, unyielding reality of survival. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming despair, the story of Percy and Cain continued, a fragile thread of hope woven through the tapestry of death, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the human heart can still beat, still hope, still fight against the inevitable. But now, as the shadow of Helix stretches across the galaxy, touching the very walls of black iron, we must return to the present, to the guard who walks the corridors of a prison that is not so different from the station of old. For the cycle of horror has not ended, it has only begun anew. The silence that fell over black iron was not the absence of sound, but the heavy, suffocating weight of a held breath, a moment of suspended time before the storm breaks the sky. In the shadow of Jupiter, where the great gas giant hung like a bruised eye in the eternal night, the prison stood as a monument to the arrogance of those who believed they could cage the chaos of the universe within walls of steel and concrete. It was a place designed for the forgotten, the discarded, the criminals and the desperate who had fallen through the cracks of a society that had long since turned its back on its own. Yet, it was not the inmates who defined the soul of this facility, nor the guards who patrolled its corridors with their heavy boots and their hollow eyes, but the man who sat in the penthouse of the warden's office, looking down upon his domain with the cold detachment of a god surveying a petri dish. Warden Duncan Cole had orchestrated his ascent to this position with the precision of a surgeon, weaving his way through the political machinations of the United Jupiter Company to secure a throne built on the bones of the condemned. He was a man who saw the suffering of others not as a tragedy, but as a necessary variable in an equation that would one day yield a cure for the very fragility of human existence. Before the first scream of the outbreak echoed through the ventilation shafts, before the air grew thick with the scent of rot and copper, black iron was already a nightmare. Cole had granted Caitlyn Mahler, his loyal architect of horror, free reign over the prison, allowing her to turn the facility into a laboratory of the most grotesque variety. The inmates were not merely punished, they were experimented upon, their bodies broken and remade in the pursuit of a biological imperative that Cole believed was the only path to humanity's salvation. He toyed with them, watching them break under the weight of their own fear, deriving a twisted satisfaction from the chaos he cultivated. The walls of the prison were lined with the secrets of his ambition, hidden behind the cold glow of holographic displays and the sterile hum of machinery that monitored every heartbeat, every tremor of fear. He was a man who had insulated himself from the reality of his actions, living in a luxury penthouse that floated above the squalor of the cells, separated from the suffering by layers of glass and the arrogance of his own power. When the crash of the Europa shuttle tore through the sky, sending a plume of fire and debris across the icy moon, Cole saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity. Jacob Lee, the surviving pilot, was dragged from the wreckage and thrown into the depths of black iron, accused of crimes he had not committed, a patsy for a system that needed a scapegoat. Cole watched the new arrival with the curiosity of a scientist observing a new specimen, knowing that the man's arrival would only add another layer of complexity to the experiment that was already underway. He remained a distant figure for most of the time that followed, a voice in the static of the intercom, a face on the monitors, a presence that felt more like a ghost than a man. He did not walk the corridors. He did not smell the rot. He did not hear the screams, for he was too far removed from the reality of the horror he had unleashed. He was a man who believed that the ends justified the means, that the slaughter of thousands was a small price to pay for the salvation of billions. As the biophage began to spread, mutating and evolving in the chaotic environment of the prison, Cole watched with a cold, calculating eye. He had released the virus deliberately, knowing that the only way to find the true specimen, the next subject zero, was through mass exposure and the relentless pressure of survival. He wanted the virus to mutate, to find that one perfect strain that would allow humanity to transcend its limitations and spread freely among the stars. The deaths of the inmates and the guards were not a tragedy to him. They were a necessary step in the evolution of the species. He was a megalomaniacal psychopath, using the supposed greater good of humanity as a rationale to perpetrate the worst crimes of humanity. He thought nothing of murdering civilians en masse, of killing off inmates and guards alike, as long as he felt it advanced his goals. He had zero remorse. The only thing that truly angered him was when Lee decided to save Danny from the biophage, rather than turn over the pure sample of the metabolized pathogen to him. The outbreak spread like a wildfire through the prison, consuming everything in its path. The cells became tombs, the corridors became slaughterhouses, the air became thick with the scent of death. The guards were the first to fall, their weapons useless against the monsters that had once been their charges. The inmates were the next, their screams echoing through the facility as they were torn apart by the creatures that had once been their fellow prisoners. The prison became a hellscape, a place where the laws of nature had been suspended, where the only law was the law of the strongest. Cole watched it all from his penthouse, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitors that showed the chaos unfolding below. He did not flinch, he did not hesitate, he did not show any sign of fear. He was a man who had prepared for this moment, who had planned for every contingency, who had calculated every variable. He knew that the virus would mutate. He knew that the creatures would evolve. He knew that the prison would become a crucible for the next stage of human evolution. As the chaos reached its peak, Cole became aware of the escape attempt, the desperate bid for freedom by Lee and the woman he had come to save. He watched as they clawed their way through the ruins of the prison, through the darkness and the blood, through the monsters that sought to tear them apart. He saw the UJC transport they had summoned, a beacon of hope in the darkness, and he made his decision. With a single command, he ordered the transport to be shot down, his voice calm and steady, his eyes cold and unfeeling. He did not care about the lives that were lost. He did not care about the pain that was caused. He only cared about the result. He wanted the pure sample of the pathogen. He wanted the next subject zero. He wanted to realize his dream of uplifting humanity and allowing it to spread freely among the stars. The confrontation that followed was inevitable, a clash of wills between a man who had lost his soul and a man who had found his. Mahler revealed the truth to Lee, that Cole had deliberately released the biophage in the prison, that he had wanted slaughter and mass exposure to find that one true specimen. Cole was a man who had sacrificed everything for his vision, who had turned his prison into a nightmare, who had turned his inmates into monsters. He was a man who believed that the only way to save humanity was to destroy it first. He was a man who had no remorse, no guilt, no fear. He was a man who had become a monster in his own right, a creature of pure ambition and cold calculation. The story of Black Iron is a story of a man who sought to play God, who sought to bridge the gap between life and death, and instead created a bridge to something far older and far more terrible. It is a story of a prison that became a tomb, of a warden who became a monster, of a virus that became a weapon. It is a story of the fragility of the human spirit when faced with the indifference of the cosmos, a story of the darkness that lies within the human heart. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming despair, the story of Lee and Danny continued, a fragile thread of hope woven through the tapestry of death, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the human heart can still beat, still hope, still fight against the inevitable. But now, as the shadow of Black Iron stretches across the galaxy, touching the very walls of the stations that follow, we must return to the present, to the guard who walks the corridors of a prison that is not so different from the prison of old. For the cycle of horror has not ended, it has only begun anew. The walls of Black Iron remember the screams of the innocent, the final prayers of the damned, and the cold, calculated silence of the machines that watched it all unfold. To walk through Black Iron is to walk through a memory of a future that had already been lost, a place where the line between the hunter and the hunted had long since dissolved into the static of the void. The prison stood as a warning, a monument to the fragility of the human spirit when faced with the indifference of the cosmos, a place where the light of the stars could not reach, and where the only truth was the cold, unyielding reality of survival. The silence that settled over the Black Iron prison was not the absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating presence, a vacuum where the air itself seemed to have curdled into something thick and unbreathable. In the aftermath of the Great Conflagration, the station had become a tomb, a cathedral of rust and blood where the echoes of the past refused to fade, clinging to the cold metal walls like a second skin. It was here, in the deepest recesses of the facility, that the final transmission began to take shape, not as a message of rescue or a plea for salvation, but as a testament to the end of an era. The man who walked these halls was no longer the man who had arrived, the one who sought to escape the crushing weight of his own history. He had become something else entirely, a creature of the dark, forged in the fires of the station's own descent into madness. His name was Jacob Lee, though names held little meaning in a place where the only identity that mattered was the ability to survive another minute, another hour, another breath. The corridors were a labyrinth of shadows, where the flickering emergency lights cast long, dancing silhouettes that seemed to reach out and grab at the ankles of the living. Every step was a negotiation with the darkness, a careful placement of boots on metal grates that groaned under the weight of a body that felt increasingly like a burden. The air was cold, biting at the lungs with a chill that seemed to come from the very core of the moon itself, a reminder that the warmth of the sun was a memory, a distant dream that belonged to a world that no longer existed. In this cold, the sounds of the station were amplified, the drip of condensation, the hum of dying machinery, the skittering of something unseen in the walls, all weaving together into a symphony of dread that played on an endless loop. It was in this atmosphere of decay that the new terrors emerged, born from the same twisted alchemy that had created the horrors before them. Among the shadows, a new kind of enemy stalked the halls, a biomechanical abomination that seemed to be a mockery of the very technology that had built the prison. These creatures, known as the biobots, were not flesh and blood, but a grotesque fusion of metal and organic matter, their forms shifting and writhing as they moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. They were the children of the station's own machinery, repurposed by the virus to hunt and kill, their eyes glowing with a cold, red light that pierced the darkness like a warning. They did not feel pain. They did not feel fear. They only knew the command to destroy, a single-minded purpose that drove them forward with a relentless, mechanical fury. As the man moved deeper into the heart of the station, the memories of those who had come before began to bleed into his own consciousness, a haunting chorus of voices that whispered of betrayal and loss. He saw the faces of the dead, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams that had been swallowed by the void. He saw the faces of the living, twisted by the virus into monsters, their humanity stripped away layer by layer until nothing remained but the raw, primal urge to feed. And yet, amidst the chaos, a single figure emerged from the darkness, a woman who had walked the same path before him, her eyes filled with a resolve that seemed to burn brighter than the dying lights of the station. She was Caitlyn Mahler, a name that carried the weight of 1,000 regrets, a woman who had been a victim and a survivor, a mother and a monster, all rolled into one. Their paths crossed in the deepest part of the facility, a place where the walls were lined with the remnants of the old world, where the ghosts of the past seemed to reach out and touch the living. The encounter was not one of battle, but of recognition, a moment where the two souls acknowledged the shared burden of their existence. They had both walked through hell, they had both lost everything, and yet they were still here, still breathing, still fighting against the inevitable. The woman spoke to him, her voice low and steady, cutting through the static of the void with a clarity that seemed almost miraculous. She spoke of the transmission, the final message that would be sent out into the darkness, a warning to the rest of the galaxy that the horror had not ended, that it had only just begun. The journey to the transmission point was a descent into the very heart of the nightmare, a path that wound through the ruins of the station, past the broken cells and the shattered glass of the observation decks. The man moved with a purpose that he had not felt in a long time, a determination to see this through, to send the message, to warn the others. The biobots were everywhere, their mechanical forms clanking and grinding as they moved, their red eyes glowing in the darkness like the eyes of a predator. The man fought them with a ferocity that was born of desperation, his movements fluid and precise, his weapons a blur of motion as he struck down the enemies that stood in his way. Each blow was a declaration of war, a rejection of the fate that had been written for him, a refusal to be swallowed by the darkness. As he reached the transmission room, the air seemed to change, the pressure of the station's atmosphere pressing down on him with a weight that was almost unbearable. The room was a sanctuary of sorts, a place where the chaos of the outside world was kept at bay by the thick walls of the chamber. In the center of the room stood the console, a complex array of buttons and screens that seemed to hum with a life of its own. The man approached the console, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the keys. The woman stood behind him, her presence a silent support, a reminder that he was not alone in this final act. The transmission began to play, a recording of the events that had transpired, a chronicle of the horror that had consumed the station. The voices of the dead filled the room, their words a testament to the suffering they had endured, the pain they had felt, the fear that had gripped their hearts. The man listened, his eyes closed as the sounds of the past washed over him, a tide of memory that threatened to drown him. But he did not break, he did not falter. He stood firm against the weight of the past, his resolve unshaken. The transmission was a warning, a message to the rest of the galaxy that the darkness was real, that the horror was real, and that the line between the human and the monster was thinner than anyone had ever imagined. As the transmission ended, the room fell silent once more, the only sound the hum of the machinery and the beating of the man's own heart. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope, a reminder that even in the face of such overwhelming despair, the human spirit could still endure. The man nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that had been spoken, a promise that the message would be heard, that the warning would be received. The station was dying, the lights were fading, the air was growing thin, but the message had been sent, and in that act, a small part of humanity had survived. The man turned to leave the room, his steps heavy with the weight of the journey ahead. The station was a tomb, a place where the dead walked and the living suffered, but it was also a place where the truth had been spoken, where the warning had been sent. The darkness was vast, the universe was indifferent, and the horrors of the station were just a small part of a much larger nightmare. But the man knew that he was not alone, that there were others out there who had survived, who had fought, who had refused to give in to the darkness. And as long as there was one person left to remember, one person left to fight, the story of the Black Iron Prison would not end. It would only continue, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the unimaginable. The corridor stretched out before him, a long, dark tunnel that seemed to have no end. The lights flickered and died, leaving him in the darkness, but he did not fear the dark, for he had become part of it. He was the guardian of the memory, the keeper of the warning, the man who had walked through hell and returned. And as he moved forward into the unknown, the silence of the station seemed to whisper his name, a final transmission that would echo through the ages, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, the human heart can still beat, still hope, still fight against the inevitable. The cycle of horror had not ended, it had only begun anew, but the man was ready, for he had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the only way to survive the darkness was to become a part of it, to walk the line between the hunter and the hunted, and to never stop moving forward. The The stars above were cold and distant, but the fire within him burned bright, a beacon in the void, a light that would never be extinguished.